The chronicles of forgotten families are often buried beneath the weight of centuries, tucked away in libraries where dust clings like the silence of graves. Yet among these decayed parchments and rotting ledgers lies a name whispered with unease, a lineage that was less a family and more a festering scar upon history, the Damnation family. Their name alone carries the stench of blasphemy, a brand that bled across borders, leaving behind tales that ordinary men would burn rather than record. Where others erected dynasties from sweat, gold, or faith, the Damnations built theirs upon shadows and whispers, upon bargains struck not with kings or clergy, but with things that slithered unseen in the folds of midnight. The family's beginnings are shrouded in ambiguity, their records intentionally vague, as though the truth was too obscene to inscribe. It is said that the first of their line arrived in Europe at the close of the 17th century, a time when superstition clashed with reason, when villagers still lit candles to ward off demons even as scientists mapped the heavens. He came with no history, no lineage, only wealth that appeared endless, and influence that grew overnight, spreading like ink spilled across parchment. Whispers claimed he had no shadow, that mirrors showed him as an outline only, a hollow figure with eyes darker than the void. Those who dined at his table returned to their homes pale and silent, unwilling to speak of what they had seen. The estate he built rose in stark contrast to the countryside around it, where cottages wore thatched roofs and churches lifted humble spires. The Damnation manor grew like a tumor of stone, each corner sharp as though meant to wound the very air. Windows gaped like empty sockets, corridors twisted without logic, and a chapel was constructed not toward the east as custom demanded, but toward the black heart of the forest where the villagers swore voices murmured on nights without wind. The land itself recoiled, crops withered near the estate, and animals refused to graze too close. Even before the first heir was born, the manor was said to breathe, its walls groaning at night as though restless with hunger. The Damnations thrived despite the unease they stirred. While wars bled the land and plague-hollowed villages, their family grew in wealth, untouched by famine or fire. Their children were pale and strange, their laughter echoing in empty halls like brittle glass. Visitors recorded their oddities in hushed tones, children who spoke in languages unlearned, women who sang hymns backward, men who never seemed to age until they collapsed suddenly, their bodies twisted as though something within had clawed its way out. Priests came with holy water and crucifixes but left quickly, their prayers faltering, their eyes wide with silent terror. By the time the Enlightenment dawned, scholars had begun collecting rumors of the family. Some argued the Damnations were merely eccentric nobles, their reputation exaggerated by jealous neighbors. But others believed darker truths. Folklore claimed they had bartered with something beneath the earth, a pact sealed not with ink but with lifeblood, binding each generation to feed what slept in the shadows. To outsiders, this was merely superstition. Yet the manor's history was littered with disappearances. Travelers who entered its gates and never emerged. Villagers who swore to hearing screams muffled beneath the soil. The family's name was eventually scrubbed from polite society. Yet they endured, burrowing deeper into secrecy. Portraits of them show faces that seem almost alive, eyes that follow as if eager to step beyond the frame. Old journals hint at rituals hidden beneath the chapel, of gatherings where the walls wept, black tar and shadows danced independent of flame. Their wealth, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a currency of damnation, ensuring their name lived on even as others were buried by history's tide. Centuries later, the Damnation estate remains a ruin. Its windows shattered, its chapel collapsed, but the air around it is still heavy. Those who approach claim to feel watched, to hear faint whispers rising from cracks in the earth. The curse that bound them lingers, for some bargains are not undone by fire, nor broken by time. The Damnations may have been reduced to dust, their bones mingling with the soil, but their story continues, an inheritance of horror, waiting for the next soul bold or foolish enough to seek the truth. The first record of the Damnation family begins not with a birth, but with an arrival, In the winter of 1698, a man stepped off a carriage onto the frozen cobblestones of a nameless European village. He carried no crest upon his cloak, no seal to prove nobility, and yet he walked with the authority of a king. The villagers remembered him because he did not shiver in the cold. Snow clung to his shoulders but melted instantly upon contact, hissing into steam as though repelled by his very presence. His name, he claimed, was Lucian Damnation, though no parish record, no lineage, and no herald could trace that surname beyond his lips. It appeared full and terrible, as if born with him that night. Lucien's fortune seemed boundless. Within weeks he purchased acres of farmland, paid in heavy silver coins that bore strange markings unfamiliar to local mints. Merchants, eager for profit, asked no questions, though they whispered about the texture of the coins, how they felt too warm, as if freshly forged in fire. In less than a year, construction began on his manor. The villagers watched stone by stone rise into an edifice that dwarfed their church. Workers who were hired for the building spoke little of their tasks, and those who did said the foundations ran far deeper than any house should require. At night, they claimed to hear chanting beneath the ground, words in no tongue they recognized. By spring, several laborers had disappeared, their families left with purses of silver that bought their silence. Lucien lived alone in the beginning. Servants came and went, but few stayed. The ones who lasted long enough to tell their tales spoke of halls that echoed when empty, of doors that opened on their own, of mirrors that reflected more than one figure even when only a single person stood before them. One servant described seeing Lucian in the chapel at midnight, kneeling before an altar that bore no crucifix. Instead, the stone was carved with symbols so ancient, they looked less like writing and more like scars gouged into the rock. He whispered, his voice low and trembling, that Lucian bled himself onto the altar, and the blood did not drip down but seemed to sink into the stone as though swallowed. By 1701, Lucien appeared in public less often. When he did, the villagers noted he had not aged a day since his arrival. His hair remained a deep black, his face smooth and pale, though his eyes carried an intensity that made men lower their gaze. He did not laugh, did not weep, but he watched. Always he watched. Those who crossed his path felt as though weighed upon, as if their very thoughts were being counted and measured. Children avoided him, dogs howled when he passed, and yet no one dared defy him. He had by then become too powerful. The manor's chapel soon became the site of whispered rumors. Candles glowed within it hours when no prayer was expected. Smoke, thick and black, drifted from its windows, though no fire burned. On one storm-split night, a group of villagers claimed they heard voices carried on the wind, dozens speaking in unison, though only Lucian was known to reside there. The priest, urged by frightened parishioners, attempted to confront him. He never returned. Days later, his crucifix was found at the edge of the forest, twisted and blackened as if scorched by lightning. It was during this time that Lucien brought home a woman. Her name was Alaric, a widow from the southern coast, though some whispered she had been conjured rather than courted. Her beauty was strange. Her eyes an unsettling gray that seemed almost translucent. Her skin pale to the point of translucency. She was never seen outside in daylight. Together, they hosted a banquet that marked the first true gathering at the Damnation Manor. Nobles from neighboring cities attended, lured by curiosity and the promise of Lucian's wealth. They returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they had witnessed. One guest, who broke his silence after too much wine, claimed that the courses were served in reverse, the dessert first, the meats last, and the wine poured only after the blood-red soup had been drained from silver bowls. He swore the final toast was not to God or king but to something else, something whose name he dared not repeat. By 1705, the first heir was born. The child, named Adrienne, was said to have been silent from birth, her cries non-existent. She grew pale and solemn, her eyes darker than either parent's, and by the age of 3 she was seen drawing symbols into the dust of the manor's floors. Servants swore those shapes matched the carvings in the chapel, though none could read them. Alaric vanished soon after. Lucian never spoke of her absence, and when asked only smiled faintly as though remembering a private joke. Adrienne remained, raised by her father in silence and secrecy. The villagers grew restless. Crops failed near the estate, cows birthed stillborn calves, and storms seemed to gather more often above the manor's roof than anywhere else. At last they gathered torches and marched to its gates, intent on burning it to the ground. But when they reached the iron bars, they froze. The torches sputtered and died, smothered by an unnatural wind. Darkness spread, thick and suffocating, as though the night itself had been pulled closer. Some swore they saw figures watching from the windows, tall, faceless silhouettes that shifted against the flickering moonlight. Inside the manor, Lucian smiled for the first time in years. He stood at the altar, his hand bleeding freely onto the stone. Adrienne, the silent child, stood beside him. Together, they whispered words no human tongue should shape, and the walls of the chapel shuddered as though something immense moved beneath the earth. That night the pact was sealed, not in secret, but in blood, binding not only Lucian, but every heir that would follow. The Damnation family had begun, not as men or women, but as vessels of a darkness older than Scripture, deeper than death. From that moment, the family was marked. No matter the passing of years or shifting of empires, their blood would carry the weight of Lucian's bargain. Their fortune would never wane, but neither would their hunger. Their lineage was not to be remembered for deeds of nobility or acts of mercy, but for the whispers in the dark, the screams beneath the soil, and the legacy of damnation carved forever into their name. The legend of Lucian Damnation's bargain has survived in fragments, each retelling more grotesque than the last. But the essence remains the same. A man with endless ambition reached into the abyss, and something in the abyss reached back. The details are tangled in superstition and rumor, yet within them lingers a truth too dreadful to dismiss. It began, the stories claim, with a sickness of the land. The soil near the estate curdled, crops rotted in the ground before harvest, and even the streams carried an oily sheen as though poisoned by unseen hands. Lucian, though untouched by this blight, seemed to grow stronger. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural fire, and villagers swore they saw him wandering the forest at night, barefoot upon frost without leaving prints. He would vanish into the trees where no path led, and when he returned at dawn, his hands were stained dark as though he had been digging in the earth. The manor's chapel became the heart of his secrets. Its doors, once barred to all but Lucian, now remained slightly ajar at odd hours, spilling faint red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Servants whispered of groans beneath the floorboards, low and deep, as if the ground itself sighed. They refused to linger, yet curiosity gnawed at their tongues, and one night 3 of them crept down to the chapel to see for themselves. They found Lucian kneeling at the altar, his shirt torn open, his chest bleeding freely as he carved symbols into his skin with a silver blade. With each cut he whispered a word, and with each word the room darkened, the air heavy with the scent of sulfur. The servants fled before he noticed, but one never spoke again, struck mute as though fear itself had claimed her voice. The first sign of the pact came when Adrienne, his daughter, grew ill. At the age of 5, her body wasted away, her limbs brittle, her eyes sunken. Physicians declared she would not live a fortnight. Yet on the night of the new moon, Lucian carried her into the chapel, and when he emerged hours later, she walked beside him, her skin flushed with unnatural health, her dark eyes brighter than ever. The villagers saw her the next morning in the fields, standing perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though listening to something far away. They muttered prayers under their breath, but none dared accuse. It was soon after this that Lucian was said to have completed the pact in blood. Accounts differ, but one tale remains consistent, that he summoned something within the chapel's depths, an entity neither demon nor god, but something older, a presence that lurked beneath the soil of the world, patient and hungry. The altar, carved with symbols too jagged to belong to any known language, was its vessel. When Lucien bled upon it, his blood did not spill as liquid, but crawled like living veins across the stone, tracing the carvings until they glowed with a dark crimson light. The air thickened, Candles flared, and from beneath the floor came a sound like claws scraping stone. In exchange for eternal prosperity and dominion, Lucian offered not just his own life, but the lives of every heir born of his blood. They would be vessels, feeders, caretakers of the thing beneath. Their souls, tethered like chained dogs, would never escape. Death would not release them. Their torment would echo through generations. It was a bargain designed not to save a man, but to consume a lineage, and Lucian accepted it with calm reverence, as if he had been waiting for it all along. What the entity demanded was not always clear. Some whispered it sought only blood, others believed it fed on fear, despair, and the slow unraveling of sanity. Whatever the truth, its hunger was insatiable. Each generation after Lucian carried the mark, children born with strange birthmarks shaped like spirals, voices that whispered in their sleep, eyes that reflected more than one face when caught in candlelight. Those who tried to flee the curse met swift ends, their bodies found broken in fields or floating in streams, their eyes gouged clean as though something had taken them. Yet prosperity followed them like a shadow. No matter the wars that raged, no matter the plagues that spread, the Damnations thrived. Their estate doubled in size, their coffers filled with gold, and their influence reached kings and courts. Neighbors who mocked them one season were ruined the next, their lands barren, their children sickened. Lucian's wealth was seen as both miracle and blight, but none could deny its source was unholy. The pact, however, was not without rules. It was said that every generation must renew the bond, offering a sacrifice beneath the chapel on the night of the new moon. Some said it required the blood of a stranger, others claimed it demanded something far more personal, the blood of family. The Damnations guarded this secret fiercely, ensuring that no one outside their circle ever saw what transpired on those nights. Servants who stumbled too close vanished. Villagers who whispered too loudly about the screams carried on the wind were found with their tongues cut out, left dangling from the trees as warnings. Lucian himself seemed almost immortal. Decades passed, yet he aged so slowly that rumors spread of sorcery. He fathered more children, each pale and strange like Adrienne, each marked by the bargain. But when he finally died, if death is what it was, the manor shook violently, its walls groaning as if in mourning. Witnesses said his corpse did not rot but hardened, turning to something like stone, his mouth frozen open as though still whispering the words of the pact. His body was placed within a sealed chamber beneath the chapel, guarded by chains thicker than a man's arm. Yet sometimes, even years later, visitors swore they heard faint murmurs echoing through the floor. As if Lucian still prayed to the thing he had bound his family to, Adrienne inherited not only his wealth but his role as keeper of the pact. Though still young, she carried herself with the cold dignity of her father, her silence more commanding than any shouted command. Servants obeyed her instinctively, unable to look her in the eye for long. When she reached womanhood, she too bled upon the altar, her blood mingling with her father's stone corpse, renewing the bargain for her descendants. From then on, the pact was not legend, but law, etched into the marrow of every Damnation. And so the cycle began. Prosperity and horror entwined, a lineage built upon the unholy, a family destined not to live but to feed. Their name, Damnation, was no accident. It was prophecy. The manor of the Damnation family did not merely stand, it loomed, a structure that seemed less built by human hands and more exhumed from the nightmares of the earth itself. From the moment its black stones were laid, it resisted sunlight. Even at noon, shadows clung to its angles, refusing to release their grip. Villagers described it as a house that swallowed the day, and they were not wrong. Those who worked on its construction swore that each block of stone was heavier than any they had carried before, as though it resisted being raised into place, as though it longed to sink back into the ground from which it had come. Lucian Damnation had overseen every aspect of its design. He rejected the symmetrical harmony that noble estates typically embraced. Instead, he demanded angles that skewed perception, corridors that bent ever so slightly, and ceilings that seemed too high one moment and suffocatingly low the next. No room aligned with another. Some windows looked out into the forest, yet from the outside, those same windows could not be found. Servants described walking in circles within the halls, ending up in places they had not intended. The house was a labyrinth by design, as if Lucian intended to confuse not just intruders, but those who lived there. The chapel was the heart of the manor, yet its placement was unsettling. Instead of standing as an outward symbol of faith, visible to villagers and travelers, it was buried deep within the estate, down a narrow passage that smelled always of damp earth. Its altar was carved from a single slab of black stone veined with red streaks that seemed to pulse in certain light. Candles never burned steadily there. Their flames bent inward, drawn toward the altar's surface as if by invisible breath. Beneath the chapel lay crypts, though no priest consecrated them. Coffins were set into the walls, their lids carved with grotesque images of figures writhing, mouths open in eternal screams. It was whispered that not all the coffins were filled with the dead, that some contained servants who had strayed too close to the family's secrets. The curse of the Damnation family was not merely inherited, it was etched into the marrow of every child born beneath that name. From the moment of their first breath, their fate was not their own. It clung to them as a second skin, unseen yet undeniable, a shadow that followed them from cradle to grave. Lucian had secured wealth, influence, and longevity, but what he had bound into the bloodline was a destiny of horror, a pattern that repeated itself across generations with grotesque precision. Adrienne, the silent daughter, was the first to embody it fully. Though her life was unnaturally prolonged, her death was anything but peaceful. When she was nearing 50, her body began to waste in strange ways. Her eyes darkened until they were little more than black orbs. Her voice remained absent until her last week of life, when she began whispering constantly. No one could understand her, but the words were spoken in a tongue that caused even the walls to groan. On her final night, the servants claimed her body twisted backward upon itself, her limbs cracking as though pulled by invisible strings. She collapsed before the altar, her skull shattering on the stone. When they went to bury her, her body had already hardened like clay, her mouth frozen mid-whisper, her eyes unblinking. She was sealed into the family crypt, though her murmurs were still said to echo faintly through the chapel floor. Adrienne's son, Malachi, inherited the estate, and with it, the darkness. He was brilliant, a scholar of rare intellect, and amassed manuscripts of forbidden knowledge from across Europe. His obsession with the pact was unparalleled. Where his mother had silently endured it, he sought to understand it, to shape it. But knowledge offered no mercy. By the time he reached middle age, Malachi was plagued with visions, shadows crawling along the ceilings, voices that urged him to commit unspeakable acts. He was found one night in the library, his skin carved with the same symbols that adorned the altar. His blood had soaked into the bindings of the forbidden books, and his body was rigid. A grotesque smile stretched across his lips as though he had seen something beautiful in his final moment. His heirs refused to touch his corpse, leaving it in the chapel for 3 days until the shadows themselves seemed to drag it beneath the altar. The next heir, Eleonora, sought to reject the family's burden. Fierce and defiant, she fled the estate in her youth, marrying a noble in a distant city. For a time, it seemed she had escaped. She bore children, built a life far from the whispers of the House of Shadows. But the curse was not bound by walls. Her husband died within a year of their marriage, his body bloated and blackened as though drowned though no water was near. Her first child was born still, the second lived but spoke only in growls, and the third disappeared from her cradle one stormy night, the window flung open though the iron bars were unbroken. Eleonora herself was later found wandering the streets barefoot, her gown soaked in blood, muttering that they had come for her. She died raving in an asylum, her eyes gouged from her skull, though no weapon was ever found. The curse grew more erratic as generations passed. Some heirs lived long, unnaturally long, their bodies preserved far beyond natural years, yet their minds decayed into madness. They muttered to unseen companions, shrieked in the night, and clawed at their own flesh as though trying to peel something away. Others met sudden, violent ends. One drowned in a dry fountain, another found burned to ash though the bed around him remained untouched. One heir, Jonah, vanished completely, leaving only his shadow burned into the wall of his chamber as though a great light had consumed him in an instant. The women of the line fared no better. One daughter, Isolde, was said to sing every night in a voice so beautiful that travelers would gather outside the manor to listen. But those who stayed too long vanished before dawn, their bodies discovered months later deep in the woods, their faces twisted in ecstasy and terror. Isolde herself was found in her chamber one morning, her mouth torn open at the corners as though she had tried to swallow the very song she sang. Her death was not mourned by the villagers, who said she had lured too many to their doom. By the time the 19th century dawned, the damnations were no longer whispered about. They were avoided outright. Families in neighboring villages refused to marry into their bloodline, fearing contamination. Their children, pale and strange, were educated within the manor, isolated from the world. And still the curse deepened. Madness became commonplace. Heirs would spend nights in the crypt, conversing with the dead as though they were alive. Some were found dead among the coffins, their skin drained of color, their eyes wide open in horror. Others grew obsessed with mutilation, carving symbols into the walls, into books, into their own flesh. Servants, though few remained by then, often fled screaming after witnessing such acts. Yet the family's power remained untouched. The estate grew richer, their holdings expanded, and their influence lingered in courts and councils. It was as if the curse had two hands, one that destroyed the soul of every heir, and one that filled their coffers with endless wealth. To the world beyond, they remained a family of mystery and fortune. To themselves, they were prisoners of a pact that none could break. The villagers coined a phrase to describe them, the blessed and the blighted. For each blessing of wealth, health, or influence, there was an equal blight of torment, madness, or grotesque death. To be born a damnation was to be chosen, not for greatness, but for feeding the thing beneath the altar, the hunger that never slept. Through all this, the House of Shadows endured. Its halls recorded every scream, its stones absorbed every drop of blood. Each heir, no matter how far they strayed, was drawn back, as if the house itself demanded their return. And always beneath the chapel, the binding circle waited. Each generation bled upon it, and each generation was swallowed by it in turn. The lineage of the damnations was never one of triumph. It was a tale of inevitability, of souls chained to a bargain that had outlived empires. Their curse was not merely their own. It was an inheritance, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, a doom written not in ink, but in blood. And as each heir fell to madness, violence, or worse, the family name grew darker, more feared, until to speak damnation aloud was to invite misfortune itself. The rest of the manor was no less unsettling. The grand hall, where guests were occasionally entertained, stretched so wide that voices echoed endlessly, and yet the shadows at its farthest edges never lifted. Portraits of the damnation line hung there, their eyes painted too vividly, their faces too lifelike. Visitors often remarked that the portraits seemed to change subtly when unobserved, mouths curving into faint smiles, pupils widening like predators catching scent of prey. The air in that hall was always colder, and no fire, however large, could banish the chill. The bedrooms were no refuge either. Each chamber was adorned with rich velvet curtains and heavy carved furniture, but the comfort was a deception. The walls carried faint whispers at night, as though the stone itself had a voice. Guests who stayed overnight described dreams so vivid they awoke screaming, convinced they had not been asleep at all but wandering somewhere beneath the manor, lost in corridors that pulsed with living walls. Some claimed they saw figures at the foot of their beds, tall and shadowed, standing silent until dawn. The library was perhaps the most dangerous room of all. Towering shelves held volumes bound in cracked leather, many without titles, their pages filled with languages no scholar could decipher. One book was said to be written entirely in blood, the words still glistening fresh though centuries had passed. Those who read too long in the library emerged changed, their eyes hollow, their speech erratic. One servant, a boy tasked with dusting the shelves, was found days later in the forest, his body shriveled, his skin gray, his hands clutching his throat as though trying to keep something inside. Yet the manor's most sinister feature was hidden beneath its foundations. Secret passageways laced through the walls, narrow enough that only one person could slip through at a time. Some led to concealed chambers, others to staircases spiraling into the ground. Servants whispered of an entire network of tunnels beneath the manor, stretching farther than the estate's land itself, some reaching the forest, others burrowing into unknown depths. It was in those tunnels, they claimed, that the true rituals took place. Villagers passing by the estate on certain nights swore they heard screams rising not from the manor above, but from the earth below, muffled and drawn out as though the soil itself was swallowing them. One chamber, known only to the family, was said to house the binding circle, the very mark of Lucian's pact. It was carved into the stone floor, a sprawling pattern of spirals and jagged lines that seemed to twist and writhe when viewed too long. The circle could not be scrubbed away, for each attempt left the stone blackened and the cleaner ill. The family renewed their bond there each generation, their blood filling the grooves of the carvings until the entire chamber glowed red. What they saw in those moments none would ever confess, but afterward, their wealth always increased, their influence spread, and their heirs carried the mark of the curse deeper still. The birth of the child was met with both celebration and dread, for within the Damnation family, every new life meant the curse endured. The year was 1824, and the estate had already become a place spoken of only in whispers. When the infant was born, the midwives who attended the delivery swore the room fell unnaturally cold. The candle sputtered and died, though no wind stirred, and the child did not cry. He lay silent in his mother's arms, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the vaulted ceiling of the chamber as though watching something the others could not see. He was christened Elias, though from the beginning he was known by another name, the Silent Child. Elias grew with unusual swiftness, but he never spoke. Physicians examined him, pressing hands against his throat, peering into his mouth, but they found nothing wrong. His silence was not of flesh or bone. It was something deeper, woven into his very being. His parents despaired at first, but soon they realized that his silence was more than a defect. For though his lips never shaped words, he possessed a strange form of expression that unsettled even the hardened family members. He drew. By the time Elias was 3, he could produce drawings with eerie precision. Using bits of coal or scraps of chalk, he covered the floors and walls of his chamber with images that no child should have conceived. He drew figures tall and skeletal with too many limbs, their faces blank but for gaping mouths. He drew the manor not as it appeared, but as though seen through a different lens. Its halls warped, its rooms stretching endlessly, staircases twisting into nothing. Most disturbing were his depictions of the chapel. While the family altar was carved with symbols, Elias's drawings revealed far more. Beneath the altar, he sketched cavernous tunnels that descended into an abyss where vast shapes slumbered, coiled upon themselves, their eyes closed but leaking black tears. At first, the family dismissed his drawings as the nonsense of a mute child. But when servants cleaning the chapel discovered faint sounds beneath the floor, groans like distant thunder, matching the shapes Elias had sketched, they began to whisper that the boy saw truths no one else could. The family forbade the servants from speaking of it, but fear clung to them nonetheless. Elias's presence altered the atmosphere of the manor. Shadows deepened when he entered a room. Animals avoided him. Even the family dogs whined and retreated to the corners. His eyes, pale gray and reflective, seemed always focused beyond the present moment, as though he existed in 2 worlds at once. At night, his drawings grew frantic. He filled entire sheets of parchment with spirals, circles, and jagged lines that seemed to move when stared at too long. Some family members swore that the symbols matched those carved into the binding circle beneath the chapel, though Elias had never been shown the chamber. His father, desperate to understand, began collecting the boy's drawings. He laid them side by side, searching for patterns, and soon discovered that together they formed a map of the estate's hidden tunnels. The drawings revealed chambers no one had spoken of for generations, rooms buried beneath the foundations, corridors twisting into the forest beyond. Following Elias's map, the father discovered a door sealed with iron deep within the tunnels. Its surface was carved with spirals identical to those Elias scrawled in his restless hands. When he pressed his palm against it, the metal throbbed faintly, warm as living flesh. He fled before attempting to open it, but the discovery confirmed what many feared. Elias's silence was not ignorance. It was communion. As the boy grew older, his drawings became more disturbing. He no longer confined himself to paper or walls. He carved into furniture, scratched symbols into the stone floors with his fingernails until they bled. At 12, he began to draw visions of his family. He depicted his mother lying in her bed, her eyes missing. His father hanging by the neck in the library. His siblings clawing at their own faces until their flesh peeled away. These drawings unsettled the household, but none dared confront him. Within months, each vision came true exactly as Elias had rendered. His mother was found lifeless, her sockets hollowed, though no blade or intruder could explain it. His father was discovered hanged in the library, the rope biting deep into his swollen neck, though no ladder or chair stood near. His siblings succumbed to a madness that drove them to mutilation, their corpses grotesque reflections of Elias's sketches. The silent child became the sole heir of the Damnation estate. Servants whispered that the curse had chosen him in particular, granting him sight into horrors beyond mortal ken. He wandered the halls at night, his pale figure drifting through the shadows, chalk clutched in hand. When asked what he drew, he only pressed a finger to his lips, as though silencing not himself but the world. As he matured, Elias's art grew vast and sprawling. He filled entire chambers with murals, covering ceilings and floors alike. Visitors who glimpsed them claimed the drawings shifted when unobserved, their lines bending, their shapes writhing. One noble who dared examine them closely went mad within hours, clawing his eyes out while screaming about the mouths in the dark. The murals were soon sealed behind heavy drapes, but the family knew what lay beneath. It was during his 17th year that Elias revealed his final creation. In the dead of night, he led the remaining household members into the chapel. With no words, he gestured to the altar, where fresh symbols had been etched into the stone, deeper and more intricate than ever before. His hands bled from the effort, the nails torn away, yet his expression was serene. He pointed downward to the floor beneath the altar, and for the first time in generations, the family realized there was more to the binding circle than they had known. The ground split open, stone cracking as though under immense pressure, and the air filled with the stench of rot. From the chasm came a sound not unlike breathing, deep and steady, as though something vast and slumbering had stirred. Elias looked upon it with calm, his pale eyes reflecting the crimson glow that rose from below. For the first time he opened his mouth. No sound emerged, but blood poured from his lips, spilling onto the altar and down into the abyss. The ground trembled. The chapel walls shuddered. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fissure sealed. Elias collapsed, lifeless, his body pale as ash. The family buried him in the crypt, but the drawings he left behind could not be erased. Even today, the silent child's murals remain hidden in the manor, locked behind rotting wood and iron nails, whispering to those who dare linger too long. His silence had been no affliction, but a gift, a direct communion with the hunger beneath. He had revealed more than any heir before him that the family was not cursed by accident, but chosen as keepers of a slumbering thing that demanded their lineage as its vessel. Elias Damnation did not live long, but in his silence he spoke louder than all who came before him. Despite its horrors, the manor held a strange allure. Nobles traveled from afar to see it, drawn by the fascination of the grotesque. They dined in the grand hall, their laughter brittle, their eyes flicking nervously to the portraits above. They marveled at the size of the estate, though they never stayed long. Even the most arrogant guests seemed eager to leave before nightfall. For while the house showed them grandeur, it whispered its true self to those who lingered. Doors closed on their own. Footsteps followed in empty corridors. The scent of decay lingered in rooms scrubbed clean. Those who ignored the warnings often vanished, swallowed by the manor's endless maw. By the time Lucian was gone and Adrian ruled the estate, the manor had already earned its name among villagers, the House of Shadows. Few dared even to speak it aloud. Travelers skirted the estate, choosing longer routes rather than pass near its walls. And yet the manor stood untouched by decay, its stones as sharp as the day they were laid. It was said the house itself had become part of the pact, a living vessel for the thing bound beneath. It watched, it remembered, and it waited. Those who knew of the Damnation family's curse understood this much. The manor was not merely a home. It was a cage and a temple, a fortress and a tomb. It was both the cradle of their wealth and the anchor of their damnation. And as each new heir was born, the House of Shadows welcomed them, its doors groaning wide, its walls eager to embrace another soul into the lineage that could never escape. The winter of 1831 fell hard upon the countryside, snow blanketing the woods around the Damnation estate until the trees seemed to stand like brittle bones. Yet despite the season's silence, the manor stirred with unusual activity. Carriages came at midnight, their wheels muffled by the frost, carrying passengers cloaked in heavy furs and darker intentions. Men of influence and women of silent wealth, their faces obscured, slipped past the gates and into the yawning maw of the estate. These were not guests in the ordinary sense. They were pilgrims, summoned by whispers that had spread far beyond the village, drawn to the rumors of power promised by the Damnation line. The host of this assembly was Elias's uncle, Mortimer Damnation, the last surviving patriarch after Elias's blood-soaked prophecies had emptied the family of heirs. Mortimer was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a stare that seemed to pass through flesh into marrow. He had long lingered in the shadows of his brother's household, dismissed as eccentric, but with the silent child gone and the manor's secrets now half revealed, Mortimer had seized authority. He declared that the time of hiding was over, that the family's covenant demanded renewal, and that only by gathering the faithful could the hunger beneath be appeased. The gathering of the damned, as it came to be called, began beneath the chapel where the binding circle lay. The guests descended by torchlight into the depths, their shadows cast monstrously against the stone walls. The air grew warmer the deeper they went, thick with the copper tang of blood and the faint odor of sulfur. When at last they reached the chamber, they beheld the circle, freshly restored with carvings Mortimer had made himself. Deep grooves filled with the dried remains of sacrificial offerings. There, before the altar, Mortimer spoke in a voice cracked but resolute. He told them the tale of their ancestor, the first Damnation, who had bound the family to a pact sealed in blood. He recounted the silent child's visions and his final sacrifice, presenting Elias not as a tragedy, but as proof that the covenant endured. His words painted the hunger beneath the earth not as a monster, but as a god, a wellspring of power eager to share its gifts with those willing to pay the price. The guests listened in silence, their faces hidden, but their eyes shone with greed. For among them were nobles ruined by debt, politicians disgraced by scandal, and scholars who had pursued knowledge to the brink of madness. To each, Mortimer promised a reprieve, wealth without end, influence unshaken, secrets forbidden to the waking world. All they need do was kneel before the circle and offer a drop of themselves to the abyss. The ritual began with chanting, low and dissonant, guided by Mortimer's trembling voice. The guests, uncertain at first, joined in, their voices echoing until the chamber seemed to pulse with sound. One by one, they stepped forward, slicing their palms with blades Mortimer had provided, letting their blood drip into the grooves of the circle. The stone drank greedily, the lines glowing faintly as though alive. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an unseen heartbeat. As the last guest bled into the altar, the chamber shook. Dust rained from the ceiling, and a deep groan reverberated from below. Not of stone shifting, but of something vast awakening. The torches flickered, their flames bending inward as though pulled by a breath from beneath the earth. Mortimer raised his arms, his face alight with ecstasy. He shouted words in a tongue none recognized, yet all felt them resonate in their bones. Then came the answering voice. It did not emerge from the earth alone, but from within their own skulls. A chorus of whispers layered upon one another, promising, urging, commanding. Some fell to their knees, clutching their ears, while others wept with awe. The presence filled them, wrapping around their thoughts like chains of velvet. For a moment, each guest felt infinite. Their minds expanded with visions of empires bending, of death cheated, of secrets older than the stars. But entwined with the promises came the hunger, a gnawing, insatiable craving that would never be silenced. When the voice faded, silence crashed upon them like a tide. The circle lay dark again, the glow extinguished, but the bond was sealed. The guests stood changed, their eyes hollow yet burning, their bodies trembling with both terror and exhilaration. They had been marked. They were no longer merely visitors to the estate. They were initiates, bound to the same curse that had plagued the Damnations for generations. From that night forward, the manor became a gathering place not just for the family, but for a hidden order. Cloaked figures returned with offerings, livestock at first, then beggars taken from the roads, and eventually those they called enemies. The chapel's altar grew slick with blood, its stones blackened by endless sacrifice. Mortimer presided over each ritual, his frail body animated by a fervor that seemed inhuman, as though the presence below had lent him strength. The villagers, already wary of the estate, grew desperate. They whispered of screams carried on the wind at midnight, of lights glowing beneath the ground as though the earth itself had caught fire. Crops failed in the surrounding fields, milk soured, children fell ill without reason. Priests came, summoned by the frightened townsfolk, but none dared enter the manor. Those who tried did not return. Soon the villagers stopped speaking of it at all, treating the estate as if it did not exist, a scar upon their land they dared not acknowledge. Inside, however, the gathering of the damned flourished. Its members spread across Europe, carrying with them both wealth and corruption, their influence seeping into courts, universities, and temples. Yet no matter how far they traveled, they returned at least once each year to kneel before the circle and renew their bond. For the hunger beneath had not been satisfied by a single offering. It demanded more, always more, and those who failed to bring their share found themselves consumed in ways no man could describe. Mortimer himself endured longer than any suspected possible, his body wasting yet his will unbroken. In his final years, his skin clung to his bones, his voice reduced to a whisper, yet when he spoke of the thing below, his eyes blazed with unnatural fire. He claimed the silent child had shown him the way, that Elias had been the chosen herald, and that one day the hunger would rise fully into the world, clothed in flesh born of their blood. The gathering of the damned had begun as a secret meeting on a winter's night, but it became an institution of darkness, one that would outlive its founder. The curse of the Damnation family had spread beyond blood into a brotherhood of shadows that thrived on the promise of power and the terror of what slept below. And though Mortimer's bones would eventually crumble in the family crypt, the circle remained, waiting to be fed, pulsing faintly beneath the chapel like a heart that refused to die. The winter storms had barely subsided when the bells of the Damnation estate tolled once again. Not in mourning this time, but in twisted celebration. The year was 1846, and deep within the decaying halls of the manor, a new child had been born into the line. His arrival was shrouded in omens, for on the night of his birth, the forest surrounding the estate burned with phantom fire. Villagers reported seeing flames devouring the treetops, yet not a single branch was scorched when dawn came. Animals fled the countryside, their carcasses found days later as though drained of life, and the river near the manor ran black for 3 days. His mother, pale and broken from labor, whispered his name before she died. Alaric. Alaric Damnation was no ordinary heir. From infancy, the child radiated an aura that unsettled even the hardened members of the gathering of the damned. Unlike Elias, the silent child who had gazed into shadows with quiet knowing, Alaric roared from his very first breath. His cries shook the rafters of the manor, and servants claimed the walls wept condensation when his wails echoed. He grew quickly, his skin pale as wax and his hair black as midnight, his eyes twin embers that seemed to glow in candlelight. When he laughed, the sound was not innocent but sharp, cutting like a blade into those who heard it. Mortimer Damnation, frail and near death, declared that the boy was the vessel foretold by Elias's visions. He called him the heir of ashes, the one who would not merely feed the hunger beneath, but unleash it upon the world. The gathering accepted this proclamation with both awe and dread, for they had long awaited a figure who would serve as the living link between their order and the thing below. They surrounded the child with constant ritual, marking his cradle with sigils, feeding him on meat sacrificed at the circle, and whispering prayers of devotion as he slept. As Alaric grew, his nature became more apparent. At 6, he was found in the manor's library, tracing his small fingers along forbidden tomes written in languages no one had taught him. When questioned, he recited passages fluently, his voice deeper than a child's, his words twisting with strange cadences that made the lamps flicker. At 9, he led the servants into the chapel at midnight, standing before the binding circle and placing his hand upon the altar. The grooves carved into the stone flared with light at his touch, and a voice whispered through the chamber, not the distant, indistinct murmurs of before, but a clear sound, calling Alaric by name. The boy laughed and answered, though no one could comprehend the words he spoke. His voice echoed with a duality, as if something else spoke through him. Mortimer wept at the sight, proclaiming the covenant fulfilled. From then onward, Alaric was treated not as a child, but as a prophet. Members of the gathering knelt before him, seeking his blessing. They brought him offerings, coins of ancient empires, relics stolen from churches, bones unearthed from forgotten graves, and he accepted them all with the arrogance of a monarch. The black reign of Alaric began not with a coronation, but with a massacre. It was the year 1863, and the manor of the Damnations had become less a home and more a temple of horrors. Alaric, now a man in his 20s, no longer resembled the pale, strange child who had filled the walls with screams. He had grown tall and broad, his presence commanding, his gaze smoldering with the fire of something more than human. His followers called him not merely the heir of the Damnations, but the Black King, a ruler whose throne was built upon sacrifice and whose crown was forged in shadows. On the first night of his reign, he summoned the gathering into the chapel. Torches lined the walls, their flames black rather than orange, fed by oils brewed from herbs and blood. The binding circle had been expanded, the grooves widened to accommodate the blood of dozens at once. The altar, cracked from years of offerings, pulsed faintly, as though something alive throbbed beneath it. Alaric stood before them, dressed in black robes embroidered with silver spirals, his arms bare to the shoulder, marked with scars that formed runes across his skin. His voice, once the cruel laughter of a boy, now carried the authority of command. That night, he slaughtered his dissenters. 3 members of the gathering who had dared whisper doubts were dragged into the circle. Alaric did not use blades on them. He raised his hands and spoke in the guttural language he had known since childhood, and the air itself seemed to tear open. The men screamed as their bodies twisted, their flesh peeling into ribbons, their bones shattering and folding inward until nothing remained but ash that scattered across the stone. The rest of the gathering fell to their knees, not out of loyalty, but out of terror, for in that moment they realized Alaric was not simply their leader. He was the voice of the hunger beneath, its prophet made flesh. From that night forward, Alaric's dominion spread far beyond the manor. The gathering, bound to his will, became an unseen empire. They infiltrated courts, councils, and churches, each member carrying the taint of the circle within them. Nobles who bowed to Alaric found themselves enriched beyond measure, their coffers filled and rivals silenced. Those who resisted vanished, their estates left barren, their families wiped out as though by plague. Alaric's power became less a rumor and more a shadow that stretched across the land, unseen yet undeniable. His cruelty grew with his influence. He no longer sought small offerings but demanded entire villages. Caravans of chained peasants were marched into the manor under cover of night, their cries muffled by the heavy woods. They were taken to the chapel where Alaric stood waiting, his eyes burning with anticipation. The circle drank deeply, its grooves glowing brighter with each sacrifice, until the chamber itself seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of the abyss. Alaric would stand at the center, arms raised, his laughter echoing as the voices from below rose to meet him. The land around the manor withered under his reign. Fields turned barren, rivers grew foul, and the forest became a place of nightmares. Travelers who strayed near the estate disappeared, their corpses later found with symbols carved into their skin. The villagers spoke of shadows moving independently of light, of whispers that followed them home from the woods. They began to call the estate not by its name but as the Mouth, believing it to be a place where the world itself opened to swallow the living. Alaric reveled in this fear. He took to appearing before the villagers, dressed in his black robes, his eyes gleaming like coals. He would stand at the edge of the woods, watching silently as they cowered in their huts. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried curses that manifested within days. A farmer who shouted defiance found his crops rotted overnight, his children sickened with fever, and his wife vanished without trace. When the villagers prayed, their churches were found desecrated, the crosses inverted, the altars smeared with blood. Even the priests dared not speak Alaric's name, for they claimed the mere act of uttering it summoned his gaze. The Black King's reach extended even further. Through his agents, he began to manipulate wars, financing conflicts and dictating their outcomes to his advantage. Armies moved like pawns under his influence, kings and queens unknowingly serving his purpose. The Gathering, once a secret cult, had become an invisible hand shaping history itself, all under Alaric's command. He did not seek glory in records or chronicles. He sought dominion in silence, weaving himself into the very fabric of power. Yet for all his triumphs, there remained an unfulfilled hunger. The voices beneath the circle grew louder, clearer, demanding more. Alaric heard them in his dreams, calling him not simply to feed them, but to free them. He saw visions of fire sweeping across the world, of skies torn open, of seas boiling as the abyss rose. He declared to his followers that the time was near, that their generations of servitude had prepared them for the final revelation. The Gathering trembled at his words, but their fear was tempered by their dependence, for without Alaric, they had no power, no purpose. In his private chambers, Alaric descended further into madness. He filled entire walls with writings in the abyssal tongue, his hands raw and bleeding from endless scrawling. He consumed blood as though it were wine, drinking from golden chalices offered by his disciples. He surrounded himself with relics stolen from temples, not to honor them, but to desecrate them, twisting sacred symbols into profane forms. His laughter echoed through the manor at all hours, sometimes joyous, sometimes despairing, always unnatural, yet there was one constant, his obsession with the silent child. Alaric often spoke of Elias, the mute prophet whose sacrifice had paved the way. He claimed Elias whispered to him still, guiding him toward the final act. Servants reported hearing Alaric speaking in two voices at once, one his own, deep and commanding, the other soft and childlike, murmuring words that made their skin crawl. He insisted that Elias had not died but had been taken into the abyss, waiting for Alaric to open the way fully. The Black Reign of Alaric was not merely a period of terror. It was a prelude to apocalypse. Under his rule, the world beyond the estate felt the tremors of something vast and unspeakable pressing against the edges of reality. The manor pulsed with a life of its own, its stones warm to the touch, its windows glowing faintly even in moonless nights. Those who dared approach swore they heard not one voice but a chorus rising from beneath. A promise and a threat intertwined. Alaric Damnation stood at the center of it all. A man no longer entirely human, a vessel through which the abyss prepared to speak. His reign was not measured in years or deeds, but in shadows, in screams, in the slow unraveling of the natural order. And though the villagers prayed for deliverance, none came, for the Black King was not a tyrant to be toppled. He was a prophecy unfolding, a wound upon the world that could not be closed, yet with power came cruelty. Alaric began to view the servants not as caretakers but as playthings. He delighted in torment, commanding them to act out humiliations for his amusement. One maid was forced to stand barefoot in snow until her skin blistered. Another was made to leap from a high window, breaking her legs, while Alaric watched with wide-eyed glee. None dared defy him, for those who resisted met worse fates. On one occasion, a tutor attempted to discipline the boy for disobedience. That night, the man was found in his chamber, his body twisted into the shape of a spiral, his mouth torn into a grin that reached his ears. The boy claimed no part in it, yet the blood on his small hands told another story. By the time Alaric reached adolescence, he was no longer merely feared, he was worshipped. The gathering, now swollen in numbers and influence, saw him as the bridge between themselves and the abyss. Under his guidance, their rituals grew bolder. No longer content with livestock or beggars, they began to take nobles, priests, even children from distant villages. These offerings were brought before the circle, where Alaric presided with a grin, his eyes alight as blood pooled at his feet. He spoke to the hunger beneath as if conversing with a trusted companion, and the chamber trembled with each exchange. The villagers beyond the estate could not ignore the horrors forever. Disappearances mounted, their sons and daughters vanishing without trace. Some claimed to see processions of hooded figures moving through the woods at night, carrying lanterns that glowed red like embers. Hunters who ventured too near the estate were found days later, their eyes hollowed, their tongues missing. Fear turned to rage, and whispers of revolt spread, but no one dared approach the manor itself. For those who even gazed upon its black silhouette claimed to feel watched, as though something vast and hungry lingered just behind the windows. Inside the manor, Mortimer's health waned until he could no longer rise from his bed. Yet he smiled with each passing day, for he believed he would witness the culmination of the covenant before death claimed him. On his final night, Alaric visited him, placing a hand upon his chest. Witnesses swore that Mortimer's body convulsed, his skin cracking as though scorched from within. He died with his eyes wide open, staring at Alaric in terror rather than peace. The boy leaned close and whispered, "The hunger thanks you." Mortimer's corpse blackened, collapsing into ash that scattered across the bed. The black reign of Alaric had lasted for over a decade, and in that time the land surrounding the Damnation estate had become a wasteland. Villages lay abandoned, their cottages collapsed into ruins, fields stripped bare, and churches left in silence with doors nailed shut. Only shadows lingered, and the whispers of the cursed family stretched far beyond the borders of their ancestral home. Alaric himself had become more than a man. He was a presence, a shadow that haunted the dreams of kings and the prayers of peasants alike. Yet as his power grew, so too did the weight of his madness, and within that madness lay the seeds of his undoing. Whispers of revolt did not come from the peasants, for they were too broken, nor from the priests, who had long abandoned hope. Instead, they grew from within his own circle of power, the gathering of the damned. Alaric had demanded more than even his most loyal followers could endure. He required constant sacrifices, not just beggars and thieves, but noble children stolen from their homes, scholars pulled from their universities, and men of power whose disappearance shook entire cities. The gathering, once united by ambition, began to fracture under the weight of his insatiable demands. Among them rose a figure named Seraphine, a woman of striking presence and cold intellect. She had been brought into the gathering as a child, raised on the rituals of the circle, her mind molded to the abyss. For years she served Alaric faithfully, carrying out his will without hesitation. Yet unlike the others, Seraphine saw the truth hidden behind his promises. Alaric was not a savior destined to bring them eternal power. He was a vessel, consumed by the hunger beneath. and in his obsession he would drag them all into annihilation. It was Seraphine who began to gather whispers of rebellion, speaking in secret to those who had grown weary of blood. She promised them not freedom. No one who had bled for the circle could be free, but survival. If Alaric was left to his own devices, she warned, he would open the way fully, and the hunger would rise not just for them, but for the entire world. The gathering, bound by ambition and fear, began to turn its ears toward her. The revolt took root in silence, growing like mold in the dark. They plotted not to confront Alaric directly, for they knew his power was beyond any blade or spell they could muster, but to betray him at the very heart of his reign, within the chapel itself. During the great offering he had proclaimed, Alaric had announced that the time had come, that the hunger demanded not dozens, but hundreds, not villages, but cities, and that their blood would tear the veil wide open. He had promised the gathering their final reward, to stand at his side as gods when the abyss rose. On the night of the ritual, the chapel was filled with torches that cast long, twisting shadows across the stone walls. The binding circle had been widened until it encompassed nearly the entire chamber, its grooves so deep they seemed like rivers carved into the earth. Chains rattled as prisoners were dragged in, their screams swallowed by the echoing chants of the gathering. Alaric stood at the altar, his arms raised, his eyes burning with an inner fire that no mortal could withstand. His voice rolled through the chamber like thunder, speaking the tongue of the abyss with such force that the torches bent inward, their flames nearly snuffed. As the blood began to spill, Seraphine moved. With a gesture, she signaled to those who had sworn loyalty to her. In an instant, the chanting fractured. Some voices faltered, others cried out in defiance. Knives flashed, not against the prisoners, but against fellow cultists. The chapel erupted in chaos, the circle slick with blood not of sacrifices, but of the gathering itself. Alaric turned slowly, disbelief etched into his features. Then fury. His voice rose in a shriek that split the air, and with a single word the walls of the chapel groaned and cracked. The traitors fell to their knees, clutching their skulls as invisible claws raked through their minds. Some burst into flame, their bodies collapsing into ash, while others twisted and contorted, their bones snapping as they screamed. Yet still Seraphine pressed forward, her eyes locked on Alaric. She carried with her a relic stolen years before from the family's vaults, the Chalice of Silence, a vessel said to have been used by Elias, the silent child in his final sacrifice. The chalice was etched with spirals that glowed faintly in the torchlight, its surface cold even to her burning skin. Legends claimed it could contain the blood of the abyss itself, binding it for a moment, sealing what should not be freed. Seraphine raised the chalice high, shouting words not of devotion, but of defiance, her voice cutting through the cacophony. Alaric's fury became laughter, wild and unhinged. He stepped down from the altar, the circle pulsing with his every movement. "Do you think you can silence me?" he thundered. "I am the mouth of eternity. I am the fire that will consume the stars." His followers, who remained loyal, threw themselves at Seraphine, but she cut them down with the precision of one who had trained for this night her entire life. Blood spattered across the stones, feeding the circle with unintended sacrifice. The hunger below stirred, its voice rising, filling the chamber with screams not human, but cosmic. Seraphine reached the altar, the chalice clutched tight. She drove her blade into her own palm, letting her blood fill the vessel. The chalice shuddered, glowing brighter as the abyssal voices screamed in fury. Alaric lunged toward her, his hands outstretched, his eyes blazing like suns. For a moment, the two forces collided, the vessel of the abyss against the vessel of defiance, and the entire manor shook as if the earth itself would split. The clash ended in a blast of light and darkness entwined, tearing through the chapel. The altar cracked in two, the circle splintered, and the ground beneath roared with rage. When the dust settled, the chamber was a ruin. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, their blood soaking into the stone. The survivors stumbled in shock, their ears ringing with silence where once there had been endless whispers. Alaric was gone. Some claimed he had been pulled into the abyss he served, dragged screaming by the very hunger he sought to unleash. Others whispered he had fled into the shadows, waiting for the day to return. Seraphine herself lay broken, her body shattered. But the chalice remained in her grip, its spirals glowing faintly as though containing something vast and furious. The revolt had not ended the curse of the Damnations, but it had ended the reign of the Black King. For the first time in decades, the land surrounding the estate grew still. The whispers dimmed, the shadows retreated, and though the manor still loomed black against the sky, it seemed less alive, less hungry. Yet no one dared approach, for they knew the hunger beneath had not been destroyed, only delayed, waiting for the next heir bold enough or mad enough to call it forth again. From that moment, Alaric reigned alone. The gathering bent fully to his will, carrying out his decrees with fanatical devotion. His rituals grew more elaborate, involving entire villages dragged into the manor's bowels. The circle glowed brighter with each sacrifice, the voice beneath growing louder, clearer, more insistent. Some nights the manor itself shook, its stones groaning as if straining to contain what clawed at the earth below. Alaric's visions became more frequent, more violent. He spoke of fire sweeping across the world, of cities burning, of oceans boiling as the hunger rose to claim dominion. He declared that the Damnations had been chosen not merely as keepers, but as heralds of an apocalypse. His followers, intoxicated by his words, began to spread whispers through distant lands, preparing the world for what was to come. Yet even within the family, there were those who trembled. A few whispered that Alaric was not the heir of salvation, but of ruin, that he would bring not power but annihilation. But their doubts never reached his ears, for those who spoke too freely disappeared, their screams echoing faintly through the halls before silence claimed them. By the end of his adolescence, Alaric Damnation had become both master and monster, a living vessel of the abyss. His birth had been marked by omens, his life by cruelty, and his future promised only ruin. The heir of ashes was no longer a boy, but a force of damnation, shaping the family and the gathering into tools for the hunger that waited hungrily beneath the earth, biding its time for the moment when Alaric would open the way fully and unleash it upon the world. The ruins of the Damnation estate stood like a black wound against the horizon, its spires cracked and leaning, its once proud windows shattered into jagged mouths. For years after the revolt, no smoke rose from its chimneys, no torches flickered in its halls, and no carriages rattled down the broken road leading to its gates. The villagers, long haunted by its shadow, dared not approach, not even to scavenge from its wealth. To them, the manor was no longer a place of flesh and stone, but a tomb, a wound in the world where something unspeakable still lingered beneath the earth. The silence did not last. Stories began to ripple outward, carried on hushed lips across taverns and marketplaces. Some told of Seraphine's final act, how she had sealed the abyss with her blood, and how the chalice she carried glowed still within the chapel's ruins. Others whispered that Alaric had not died but had escaped into the forests, his laughter echoing through the trees on storm-tossed nights. Still others swore that the hunger remained awake, murmuring beneath the soil, waiting for the last ember of the family's bloodline to stir it once more. These stories reached further than the villages. Scholars from distant universities, priests from crumbling churches, and even nobles who had once mocked the tales found themselves drawn to the estate, each seeking their own answers. They came cloaked in curiosity, but beneath it lay obsession. For the curse of the Damnations was not just a tale of horror, it was a promise. And promises of power are never left untouched. In 1856, nearly 20 years after the revolt, a young man named Nathaniel Damnation arrived at the gates. He was the grandson of Mortimer's younger brother, his bloodline thought lost to time. He had grown up far from the estate, raised in whispers of his cursed ancestry, his family reduced to ruin and obscurity. Yet Nathaniel had not fled from the name. He had embraced it, convinced that the power that had destroyed his kin could be reclaimed and tamed. Nathaniel found the manor nearly consumed by ivy and rot, the floors sagging, the air damp with mildew. Yet the deeper he went, the more he felt it. The pulse of the circle beneath, faint but steady, like the beating of a heart asleep. In the ruined chapel, he found the altar cracked but intact, and there, clutched in the skeletal fingers of Seraphine's remains, lay the chalice of silence. Its spirals still glowed faintly, as though mocking the years that had passed. When Nathaniel touched it, the silence shattered. The whispers rushed into him, clawing at his mind, filling him with images of fire, of chains, of endless hunger. He staggered back, but did not release the chalice. Instead, he laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed in the chamber. The curse was not dead. It lived, and through him it would rise again. Word spread quickly that a new damnation had returned to the estate. The villagers, terrified, fled further into the countryside, abandoning farms and cottages within sight of the manor. Scholars came again, this time seeking Nathaniel himself. But few returned, and those who did spoke of his eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Some claimed he had begun to rebuild the gathering, sending emissaries into cities to recruit the desperate, the ambitious, and the damned. Yet Nathaniel's reign was not like Alaric's. Where Alaric had ruled with terror, Nathaniel cloaked himself in charm. He invited men of science, promising them secrets beyond their wildest theories. He lured priests, telling them the abyss was not their enemy but the true God they had long denied. He welcomed nobles, whispering promises of eternal dynasties. To each he gave a taste of the circle's power, never enough to sate them, but always enough to bind them. The gathering was reborn, subtler and more dangerous than before. Still, the hunger beneath the earth had not changed. It demanded sacrifice, and Nathaniel was more than willing to oblige. Prisoners began to vanish again, criminals at first, then the poor, then anyone whose disappearance could be explained away. The chapel's stones darkened once more with blood, and the whispers in the soil grew louder, vibrating through the manor until it seemed alive again. Nathaniel told his followers that he would succeed where Alaric failed, that he would not be consumed, but would ascend, mastering the abyss rather than serving it. Yet in the stillness of night, when the whispers clawed too deeply into his skull, he could feel the truth that he was no master, only another vessel in a lineage that could never escape. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world beyond the estate had changed. Empires rose and fell, cities grew vast, machines rattled across iron rails, and new sciences promised to banish superstition. Yet even in this age of progress, the Damnation estate remained untouched, a black relic upon the land. Explorers with cameras and notebooks attempted to breach its secrets, but their photographs returned blurred, their notes incoherent. Some never returned at all. In time, the estate became less a physical place than a myth. Children whispered of it in schoolyards, daring each other to walk the road leading to its gates. Travelers told of glimpsing lights in its windows on stormy nights. Soldiers marching past during wars claimed to hear chanting in languages they did not understand. The manor became a scar on the land's memory, eternal and immovable. Nathaniel's fate was never known. Some claimed he achieved his ascension, his body dissolving into shadows that spread across the estate. Others believed he was torn apart in the chapel, his screams echoing through the earth until the hunger swallowed him whole. Yet one truth remained unshaken. The circle endured, the chalice endured, and the whispers endured. The Damnation family had begun as a single covenant centuries earlier, but by the end it was more than a lineage. It was a contagion, a curse that seeped into the land itself, infecting all who came too close. Generations passed, but still the manor stood, waiting. The villagers avoided it, the scholars debated it, and the faithful of the gathering returned to it, generation after generation, like moths to a flame that never extinguished. And so the story of the Damnations did not end. It could not, for as long as the hunger beneath the world slept, it would whisper. And as long as it whispered, there would always be someone willing to listen. The estate, broken and blackened, was not merely a house, but a mouth, and though it lay still, its silence was only an illusion. The heart beneath still beat, slow and patient, waiting for the day it would rise again. The legacy of ashes was not in the ruin of stone, nor in the blood spilled across centuries, but in the certainty that the Damnations had carved themselves into the marrow of history. Empires might crumble, kings might fall, but the curse endured. And somewhere in the silence of night, the whispers laughed.